The wind at the Laramie station had already stripped the warmth from the afternoon by the time Willa Dunmore understood no one was coming for her. She had traveled 1,200 miles on the strength of a letter and a name that no longer existed in this town. What she did not yet know was that before the month was out, a rancher who had not spoken more than 10 words to a stranger in 3 years would stand between her and a man twice his size and tell him quietly without raising his voice that she was not going anywhere. Willa Dunmore stepped off the train at Laramie with a folded letter in her coat pocket and a trunk that held everything she owned. The letter gave an address on the North Road, a homestead claim under her cousin Amos Dunmore's name. She had carried that address for 1,200 miles, and it had led her nowhere. The station master didn't recognize the name. Neither did the man at the livery. It was the blacksmith wiping soot from his hands who finally told her plain a grass fire that summer had burned 3 claims past Cedar Creek, and the Dunmore place was one of them. Amos had taken what stock survived and gone on to Idaho. Nobody had an address for where. Willa walked back to the station platform because it was the only place in town she knew twice and sat on her trunk. She did not cry. She had left Kentucky with her father's ledger and little else after a man named Colonel Ashby forged her father's signature on a debt note, and a county judge believed the white man's paper over the black woman's protest. The farm 3 generations built was gone in an afternoon. Amos had been her last door. Now it was closed too. A commotion rose from the stock pens, a gelding half mad with fear rearing against a rope, looped too tight around its neck, while 2 drovers shouted and grabbed at his halter, making the animal worse with every attempt. Willa didn't decide to move. Her body simply went the way it always had, around a frightened horse, faster than her own good sense could object. She walked wide and slow, speaking low, the same even tone her father used on a green colt. "Easy now. Nobody's going to hurt you. Easy." The gelding's ears found her voice before its eyes found her face swiveling toward the sound of something that wasn't shouting for the first time since the trouble started. By the time she reached its head, it was trembling, but still its breath coming down out of its chest instead of up through its throat. She loosened the rope herself, murmuring the whole while, and stepped back before anyone thought to thank her. "Where in the blazes did you learn that?" One of the drovers asked more accusation than gratitude in his tone, as though she'd shown him up rather than saved his horse a broken leg. "My father," Willa said simply, and didn't elaborate further, already turning back toward her trunk, unwilling to hand a stranger any more of her story than the moment strictly required. A man on a bay horse at the edge of the yard had watched the whole thing without helping and without looking away. Tall, sun-weathered quiet in the way of men who spent more hours with animals than people. He didn't ride over. He simply sat a moment longer, taking in her steady hands, her travel-worn dress, the trunk, sitting alone on the platform, then turned his horse north without a word. Willa didn't know his name. She only knew he'd seen something in her the rest of the town hadn't bothered to look for. The station master at least was kind enough to point her toward the mercantile before he locked up for the evening, and Willa walked the length of Laramie's main street, with her trunk left temporarily in his care, taking in the town that would either become home or one more place she'd passed through. It was smaller than Lowell, dustier, the buildings squatter and more practical, but there was a wideness to the sky here that Massachusetts had never offered her, and despite everything, she found herself looking up at it more than once. At the mercantile painted Turners in tall red letters, the sharp-eyed woman behind the counter took her measure quickly and without unkindness and directed her to Foster House 2 streets over. She found a room that evening at Foster House run by a stout widow named Mrs. Foster, who asked no more questions than necessary. "Supper's at 6, the widow said, showing her to a small room at the back plain, but swept clean, "whether you've the stomach for it tonight or not. Grief doesn't excuse a body from eating in my experience." Willa managed half a bowl of stew before her legs carried her back upstairs on their own accord. Alone in the small room, she unwrapped her father's ledger from its oilcloth, 20 years of his handwriting, the only inheritance no one could forge away from her. She had no cousin, no claim, no place on any map with her name on it. Only a skill Kentucky hadn't valued enough to keep her safe, and a Wyoming town that owed her nothing. She thought briefly of writing to someone back home to say she'd arrived safely, and then remembered there was no one left to write to. That thought settled harder than the day's disappointment had, and she let herself feel the full weight of it only once alone before folding it away, same as she'd folded away every other loss that had come before it. She did not know that the man on the bay horse was already turning her over in his mind on the ride home. Ezra Calloway told himself he'd ridden into town for feed and nails. He found Willa sweeping Foster House's porch in exchange for board, and stood at the gate a moment hat in hand, feeling foolish in a way he hadn't since he was a boy. "Ma'am, I saw what you did with that gelding. It didn't need much, just needed the rope off. Most people don't see that." He turned his hat over once. "I've got 11 head that need gentle handling. 2 of them I can't get near. I could use someone who knows what you know." She looked at him properly for the first time. "You don't know anything about me." "No," he admitted. "I know what I saw. It wasn't charm, and it wasn't smooth, and Willa had learned to distrust both. But there was nothing smooth in the plain, embarrassed way he stood there. "I don't want charity," she said. "I'm not offering any. Fair wages, full day's work expected in return. You'd keep your room in town." She thought of the ledger upstairs, of every skill in it going to waste. "I'll come look at your horses. That's all I'm promising. That's all I'm asking." Monday. She walked the 4 miles out along a road still cool with morning shadow, and found the ranch smaller than expected, but well-kept fences, mended troughs, clean, a barn that despite its patched roof was swept and orderly. It told her something about the man before he'd said a word that morning. A place kept this carefully by a man alone said either that he had nothing else to occupy his hands, or that he cared for what little he had left more than most men cared for a great deal. She suspected, watching him come out to meet her, that it was the second. Ezra walked her straight to the trouble, a mare guarding some old hurt, a gelding flinching from raised hands. "I don't break horses, Mr. Calloway. My father never did. Breaking just teaches an animal to give up. I gentle them. It takes longer. It works better." How much longer? However long the horse needs. Could be a week. Could be a season. He considered that a long moment, studying the mare's pinned ears and the gelding's flinch, and something in his face shifted, not doubt, but a kind of careful respect she hadn't expected from a man hiring cheap labor for a problem he wanted solved fast. "My uncle used to say, a man in a hurry ends up paying twice for the same job," he said. "Take the time you need. I'd rather have it done right than done fast." It was the first sentence anyone in Wyoming had said to her that asked nothing except her honest best. She rolled up her sleeves and got to work speaking low to the mare, letting the animal set the pace rather than the other way around. By mid-morning, the mare had stopped pinning her ears whenever Willa's hand came near the saddle blanket, which was more progress than the horse had shown anyone else in a month. Ezra brought her water at noon without being asked, set it on the fence post, and stood a while at the rail, with his forearms crossed, watching the quiet, patient way she moved. He didn't offer instruction. He didn't offer praise either, not yet. But there was something in the stillness of his attention that Willa found she didn't mind. A kind of respect that didn't need words to prove itself. If he stood there a while longer than his morning chores required, neither of them remarked on it. The work settled into rhythm. Willa walked out before sunup, gentled the horses hour by patient hour, walked back after dusk. Each morning a tin cup of coffee waited on the fence post, left without a word, and became simply a fact of her mornings. 3 weeks in a storm rolled down off the ridge faster than either of them had judged the sky going the color of a bruise, while Willa was still finishing with the mare. Her attention so fixed on the animal's progress that she barely registered the wind picking up until the first hard drops began hammering the barn roof. Ezra came out of the main house at a near run, hatless, as the first real rain hit. "You can't walk back in this. I've walked in rain before, not this kind." He nodded at the sky, unreadable and darkening fast. "Wait it out. I'll feed you plain, but I'll feed you." She stayed more out of practicality than anything else, and found herself at his table for the first time, cornbread beans coffee gone lukewarm, and conversation that came easier than either of them expected once the day's formality wore thin. "You cook this every night?" she asked, surprised at how decent the cornbread was. "Learned or starved," he said. "Man alone out here doesn't get to be particular. Alma did the cooking mostly before. I've had 3 years to get passable at it out of necessity more than talent." He refilled her cup without asking the same unthinking courtesy he showed the horses. "Your turn. Tell me something about Kentucky that isn't about the farm." She thought a moment, turning her cup in her hands. "There's a ridge behind where we lived that goes gold in October, whole hillside of it, like the trees decided to argue with the sky about which of them got to be brightest. I used to think it was the prettiest thing I'd ever see before I saw those mountains out past your east pasture. Wyoming's not much for gold, mostly just gray and green and more gray. I don't know. The light does something to it in the evening. Turns it decent enough." She caught herself before she said more, aware she was talking around a compliment rather than through it, and was relieved when he let it pass without remark, though the corner of his mouth had moved in a way that suggested he'd caught her meaning regardless. "I'll take decent enough," he said quiet. "Man doesn't need gold hillsides if the gray and green suits somebody's eye well enough to stay a while and see what the seasons bring around here come autumn." He asked about her mother next, and she told him what little she remembered, a woman who'd died when Willa was 6, leaving behind only a hymn she used to hum and a way of braiding hair that Willa still used out of habit more than skill. He told her about his own mother's biscuits, the recipe lost when she died, how Alma had tried 3 times to recreate it and given up laughing each time, declaring the ranch cursed against good biscuits specifically. "She sounds like she was easy to laugh," Willa said. "She was. Best thing about her, maybe. This place got quieter than I knew what to do with after." He didn't say more than that, and she didn't push him to understanding. There were griefs that only wanted acknowledging, not examining. When the rain thinned to a drizzle near 10, he walked her partway toward town with a lantern, and before she could argue, shrugged out of his own coat and set it over her shoulders. "Yours is thin, mine isn't. You'll catch your death. I've got a shorter walk back than you do." He said it plain the same way he said everything, though the look he gave her lingered a beat longer than the words required. She wore his coat the rest of the way to Foster House warm, despite the lingering drizzle and the mud sucking at her boots, and returned it folded neatly the next morning, freshly brushed. Neither of them mentioned that she'd slept with it draped over her own blanket that night, because the rain had turned the room cold, and his coat oddly had not still holding some faint trace of wood smoke and horse, and the particular warmth of the man who'd worn it. She told herself it was only practical keeping warm, however she could manage it. She did not entirely believe herself. The horse Ezra brought in the 4th week was worse off than any before, a big bay named Solomon Ribs, showing a rope scar behind his ears, flinching from any hand raised above shoulder height. "Fellow at the sale barn said nobody would touch him," Ezra said. "Figured I'd try on account of you." Willa worked with Solomon 2 full days before he'd simply stand in her sight without bolting. The first day she did nothing but sit on an overturned bucket at a distance he could tolerate, letting him grow used to the shape of her. The second she moved a few feet closer and stayed there an hour, saying nothing, until his ears stopped pinning flat every time she shifted her weight. On the fourth day, she brought her father's ledger to the barn and read his notes aloud, not for the horse's understanding, but because her father always said a frightened animal calmed faster to a voice asking nothing of it. Ezra leaned in the stall door and listened. Your father wrote all that. 20 years of it. He trained horses for the Ashby farm free man respected, until Colonel Ashby's grandson forged a debt note, and a judge believed a white man's paper over a black man's word. We lost the farm in an afternoon. My father died 8 months later. I don't believe those things unconnected. Ezra didn't offer easy comfort, and she was grateful for it. That's a hard thing to carry alone, he said, and let the silence sit honest between them. I'm not looking to be pitied. I'm not offering pity. I'm offering that I know something about starting over, too. My wife died 3 years back. Influenza 4 days, and I've been keeping this place going since by not thinking too hard about the house being emptier than it used to be. What was her name? Alma. He said it without flinching. She'd have liked you. No patience for foolishness, same as you. By week's end, Solomon ate from Willa's open palm. By the next, he let Ezra brush him too, so long as she stood near, and Ezra took to finding reasons to be in the barn at the same hour she worked with the gelding, offering little beyond his presence, and the occasional question about her father's methods, which she answered patiently, glad to have someone who wanted to understand, rather than simply benefit from what she knew. Your father sounds like he was a rare kind of man, Ezra said one evening, watching Solomon lean into Willa's palm for the last of the sugar she'd brought. He was. Folks used to say he had more patience with a green colt than most preachers had with their own congregations. She smiled, the first easy smile Ezra had seen cross her face since she'd arrived, and something in his chest turned over at the sight of it, unbidden and unmistakable. I can see where you got it then, he said, and though it was a simple thing to say, it settled into her like the first true compliment she'd received in longer than she cared to count. It was that same week that Solomon, newly brave enough to test his own recovered confidence, took it into his head to steal Ezra's hat clean off his head while he leaned against the stall door, trotting a triumphant circle around the paddock with the battered old thing hanging from his teeth like a prize. Ezra's expression of pure betrayed dignity, chasing after a horse he himself had gentled into stealing from him, struck Willa so unexpectedly funny that she laughed, really laughed, head back, both hands braced on her knees, the kind of laugh she hadn't allowed herself since long before Kentucky went wrong. Ezra stopped chasing the horse entirely and simply stood there hatless, watching her. Instead, something undone in his face that had nothing to do with Solomon or the hat at all. Well, he said when she'd finally gotten hold of herself enough to notice him staring, at least somebody's getting some use out of my suffering. I'm sorry. She managed not sorry in the least. You should have seen your face. I'd rather see yours just now if it's all the same to you. He said quiet enough that she almost didn't catch it, and the words landed somewhere low in her chest and stayed there long after Solomon had grown bored of the hat and dropped it in the mud. Ezra found himself thinking, retrieving his ruined hat with as much dignity as he could muster, that trust like a house feeling less empty couldn't be rushed. Only earned one patient day at a time, same as whatever was building quietly between the two of them. Cole Dobbs rode up on a Tuesday, with no cattle business to justify it. A lean man with a lazy, unhurried way of sitting a horse that Willa had learned over years of reading. Men, the way her father had taught her to read animals, usually meant trouble rather than ease. Willa was in the corral when he arrived, and felt his eyes settle on her the way a hand might unwelcome and slow lingering, longer than any honest purpose required. Didn't know you'd taken on help, he said to Ezra, though his gaze stayed on Willa. She's good at her work, I'm sure. Dobbs walked his horse closer to the fence, closer to Willa than the conversation required, forcing her to step back from the rail. Funny thing, nobody in town knows much about her. No family, no references anybody's seen. Just showed up and moved on to a bachelor's land like she belongs here. She lives in town Dobbs, and her work speaks for itself. Mr. Bragg just thinks folks ought to be careful. A woman like her alone with a man like you, people talk. Ezra crossed the yard before Dobbs finished the sentence and put himself at the fence rail directly between the two of them, close enough that Dobbs' horse shifted back a step. You've said your piece. Say it from your own side of my fence from now on. Dobbs smiled unbothered, but he backed his horse a length before he touched his hat and rode off the first small retreat Willa had seen anyone make from him. Willa let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Her hands, she noticed, had gone stiff on the brush without her permission, and she made herself loosen them before the mare picked up on her tension, remembering her father's old rule that a frightened rider made a frightened horse, and she'd not give Dobbs the satisfaction of unsettling either the mare or herself. That wasn't about cattle, she said. No. Ezra's jaw was tight. Bragg wants this land. He's tried buying it twice already, and I've turned him down twice. If he can't buy it outright, he'll try to make it too costly to keep. And he'll use whatever's closest to hand to do it, including you, if I let him. You didn't have to do that. Step between us like that. Wasn't a question of having to. He looked at her steady. Man gets that close to you again, I won't be so polite about the asking. I've faced worse than Cole Dobbs's insinuations, she said, though her voice was quieter than she meant it to be. I don't doubt it. Doesn't mean you ought to have to working an honest job on honest land. He looked out toward the road. Dobbs had ridden down something hard and unhurried in his expression. I'll not have a man like that deciding who belongs on this ranch. Not you. Not anybody. Something in the way he said it settled low and warm in Willa's chest, entirely separate from the fear Dobbs had left behind him. The whispers reached town before Willa did. At Turner's Mercantile, 2 women fell quiet near the flour barrels, and a man named Hollis took his time at the counter just to make her wait longer. I'll take my turn when the lady's finished, Hollis, Mrs. Turner said sharply. Don't recall raising you to shove past a paying customer. Didn't figure she'd mind, Hollis said with a look that made his meaning plain. Seeing as how she's used to waiting on folks out at the Calloway place, Willa kept her hands still on the counter and her voice level despite the heat rising in her chest. I'll wait my turn, same as I'd expect you to wait yours. Mrs. Turner rang up his purchase with unnecessary speed and told him the door was behind him. Once he'd gone, her face gentled, and she set Willa's small parcel down with more care than the item required, as though the gesture itself might make up for what the town owed and hadn't paid. Don't mind Hollis. Repeats whatever Cole Dobbs says over cards at the saloon, and half these folks wouldn't know an honest day's work from a hole in the ground, but they'll gossip about somebody doing it just the same. I've known Ezra Calloway 10 years. Watched him bury a wife and keep that ranch running alone rather than let it go to seed out of grief. And I've watched you walk 8 miles a day rather than take a moment's charity from anybody, rain or shine, since the day you arrived. That's worth more than gossip, and most folks with sense in this town know it, even if they're too cowardly to say so out loud. In the weeks that gossip took to build and finally break against them, Willa and Ezra had fallen into a habit. Neither of them announced Sunday afternoons when the horses didn't need her, and the fences didn't need him. They walked the creek path together, no particular destination in mind. He taught her the names of the wildflowers that grew wild along the bank. Indian paintbrush, blue flax. The stubborn little cinquefoil that bloomed even after frost. And she taught him in turn to read the different moods of a horse's ears, the way her father had taught her until he swore he couldn't look at his own stock anymore, without hearing her voice narrating what they were feeling. They talked more on those walks than either of them talked the rest of the week. Combined about small things, mostly the shape of clouds, a hawk circling the far ridge, the particular stubbornness of a fence post that refused to sit straight, no matter how many times Ezra reset it, but sometimes about larger things too carefully, the way 2 people test whether a plank of old flooring will hold their weight before committing their full weight to it. She learned he'd wanted once to raise cattle rather than horses, before his father talked him out of it on account of the water. He learned she'd wanted once to open her own stable train horses under her own name rather than her father's, before the world made that particular dream considerably harder to hold on to than it should have been. Neither dream, they both admitted, felt entirely out of reach anymore, walking a creek path together on a Sunday afternoon, with nothing but time ahead of them. Neither of them called it courting. Both of them understood it was, and both were content for a while yet to let it stay quietly unnamed, rather than risk hurrying something that was already growing exactly as it should. The following Saturday, Ezra found reason to have errands in town the same afternoon. Willa needed thread, and they walked in together, not announced as anything, but understood by everyone who saw it. Nobody shoved past her this time. A rancher's grown son, new to town, and unaware of the currents beneath it, lingered at the counter longer than necessary, complimenting Willa's eye for good thread, until Ezra's quiet presence at her elbow made the young man remember an errand elsewhere rather suddenly. Willa caught the flicker of satisfaction Ezra failed to hide and found she didn't mind it one bit. "You didn't have to run him off," she said on the walk back, teasing. "Didn't run anybody off. Just stood where I was standing." But there was color at the back of his neck that hadn't been there before, and Willa decided she liked knowing she could put it there. "You're jealous," she said, delighted at the discovery, unable to keep the grin from her own face. "I'm cautious," he corrected, though the color at the back of his neck deepened rather than faded. "That boy had no business talking to you that long about thread. Ezra Calloway, I do believe you're truly jealous of a 19-year-old boy over nothing more than a spool of thread." "Maybe I am," he admitted finally after a long moment, with the particular gruffness of a man conceding a point he'd rather not have to concede at all. "Doesn't mean I have to enjoy watching it happen." They took the long way back to the ranch that afternoon, following the creek path rather than the road, though neither of them remarked on the detour. Ezra pointed out a stand of chokecherry Alma used to gather for jam, and Willa found herself asking more questions about the woman who'd lived in that house before her, not out of jealousy, but a genuine wish to understand the shape of the grief she'd found him carrying. "You're not troubled talking about her?" Ezra asked, surprised. "Why would I be? She mattered to you. That doesn't take anything away from me." Willa considered the creek a moment, the way the light broke over it. "Where I come from, folks act like grief and new happiness can't sit at the same table. I never understood that. My father grieved my mother every day of his life and still found room enough to be glad of the years he had left. Seems to me a man capable of loving somebody that well is exactly the kind of man worth trusting with it a second time." Ezra didn't answer right away, but he reached over and, without quite deciding, took her hand for the last stretch of the walk. Nothing more than that, fingers loosely laced, but neither of them let go until the ranch house came into view, and habit made them separate before anyone could see. Bragg came himself the following week, dismounting alone, though two of his men waited at the gate. The easy confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted, written plain across his face. "I'm prepared to offer $1,200 for this parcel," he told Ezra on the porch steps, declining the offer of coffee with a small dismissive wave. "More than fair, and more than I've offered any small outfit along this stretch. But there's a wrinkle you might not know about, and I'd hate for you to hear it first from the county rather than from me, neighbor to neighbor. Your father's boundary filing at the West Fork can't be found at the county office. Only his marker, no matching paper. If it's truly missing, the line reverts east to the 1868 survey onto my side of the creek. I'd rather buy you out fair than see you lose it for nothing in a filing dispute. Think on it. I'll want an answer inside the month." He left without waiting for a reply, which was its own kind of answer, a man confident the ground was already shifting beneath the one he'd come to threaten. Ezra didn't go inside right away. He walked instead to his father's old marker post, half buried in creek grass, running his thumb over carved initials 40 years weathered, trying to remember if his father had ever once mentioned trouble with the filing. He couldn't. But 40 years was a long time, and memory wasn't paper. Willa found him there, when she came looking, having heard enough from the corral to understand the shape of the trouble even without every word of it. "He's bluffing," she said. "Maybe, maybe not." Ezra stood brushing dust from his knees. "My father wasn't a man who forgot paperwork, but he wasn't much for county offices either. Distrusted them. Said a man's word and his fence line ought to be proof enough, and look where that's gotten me. My father lost his whole farm to a paper nobody had business trusting over the truth," Willa said, careful with the words. "I was in the room when the judge read that forged note aloud. I watched grown men who'd known my father 20 years look at their own boots instead of speaking up for him. I know exactly what it feels like to watch the law choose a lie because the lie came dressed better. But a false paper leaves a seam if you know how to look. Let me help you go through the county records. I'll not stand by and watch it happen to you if there's a chance to stop it." They went the next morning. The clerk, a stooped man named Whitlow, produced a stack of water-damaged ledgers with more grumbling than hope. "Half these got water damage from the flood in 74 soon," he warned, setting the volumes down with visible reluctance. "Might take some digging, and I'll thank you not to leave my shelves worse than you found them." The first hour turned up nothing but ruined pages, whole sections gone to brown pulp at the edges where the old flood had gotten in. Willa worked through them with the same patient method her father had taught her for a season's tangled feed receipts. Start at the edges of the problem and work inward. Ezra paced more than he helped, and twice she had to remind him gently that hovering over her shoulder wouldn't make the pages turn any faster. "Sit," she told him, finally nodding at the stool across the table. "You're making Whitlow nervous, and you're making me nervous, and neither of those things is helping your boundary line." He sat chastened and watched her work. Instead, the same quiet attention he'd once given her in the corral, until watching her hands move steady over page after page seemed to settle something in him, better than pacing had. By mid-afternoon, his hope had thinned considerably. Then Willa, flipping through a thin volume mislabeled Mining Claims MSC, stopped. "Here, an amended filing 1871. Your father corrected the boundary to the West Fork, matching his marker. It's just been bound in the wrong volume, shelved with mining claims instead of grazing patents. That's not a missing filing, Mr. Calloway. That's one nobody's looked for in 15 years. Whitlow confirmed it, adjusting his spectacles twice before admitting she was right. "I'll have it certified within the week." Relief moved through Ezra visibly. "You just saved this ranch. You saved it 20 years ago, filing it right the first time. I just found the paper." She said it plainly, but something in her voice carried more warmth than the words alone accounted for. Their hands rested near the ledger's open page, close enough that his fingers brushed hers when he reached to check the seal. Neither pulled away, and neither felt any particular hurry to explain why. Walking home that evening, the fight with Bragg no longer unwinnable, Ezra said, "Thank you, not just for today. You don't have to keep thanking me. Maybe I want to. Maybe I've been finding reasons to for a while now." The certified filing settled the boundary within the week. Judge Harmon reviewed it without ceremony, ruled the western line confirmed, and Bragg's claim was dismissed outright. It should have ended there. For Dobbs, it didn't. Willa was walking back to town alone at dusk 2 days later, later than usual, when Dobbs stepped his horse out from the tree line onto the road ahead of her, blocking it deliberately. "Your kind of trick worked on the judge," he said, dismounting, "but it won't work twice. Bragg's finished with this, but I'm not obliged to be so forgiving." He closed the distance fast and caught her wrist hard enough to bruise. "Maybe you ought to remember what you are and whose land you're truly welcome on." Willa didn't cry out. She planted her feet and looked him dead in the eye, refusing him the satisfaction of her fear, though her heart hammered against her ribs, and her mind raced through every hard lesson her father had ever taught her about staying calm in front of something dangerous. She thought absurdly of Solomon on his worst day, and made herself breathe the way she'd have coached a frightened animal to breathe in and slow, and even giving Dobbs nothing to feed on. "You're hurting me," she said flat, refusing to let her voice shake. "Let go. When I'm finished." "You're finished now." The words came out steadier than she felt, and for a moment something like uncertainty flickered across Dobbs' face, as though he hadn't expected her to hold so still against him. Hoofbeats came fast up the road behind her Ezra, who'd ridden out looking when she hadn't returned on schedule. He was down from his horse before it had fully stopped, and he did not raise his voice. "Let go of her." 3 words, flat and absolute. Dobbs was a bigger man than Ezra by a head and a half broad through the shoulders, the kind of size that had likely won him every argument he'd ever started with his fists before this one. He didn't let go at first, testing whether the smaller man meant it, his grip tightening on Willa's wrist as if daring Ezra to make good on his warning. Ezra stepped between them anyway, close enough that Dobbs had to release Willa's wrist or shove past him, and Ezra did not move, did not blink, did not so much as raise a fist, just stood immovable as the marker post at the West Fork, his whole body a wall between the two of them. Willa Freed stepped back, but did not run, watching with her heart in her throat, as the 2 men measured each other in the fading light. "She's not going anywhere," Ezra said quiet. "And you're done talking to her, done looking at her, done riding this road when you know she walks it. You so much as tip your hat to her again, Bragg's judgment won't be the only thing that comes down on this county." Dobbs shoved Ezra's shoulder once, testing him further, and Ezra didn't move an inch, only held his ground, with a stillness more unnerving than any blow could have been. "You want to hit me, Dobbs? Go ahead," Ezra said, low and even. "There's 3 ranchers due up this road inside the hour, and Sorensen's boy already saw you grab her. You'll be finished in this county either way. Question's just whether you're finished with a black eye or without one." Something in that landed harder than a fist would have. Whatever Dobbs saw in Ezra's face convinced him the fight wasn't worth finishing. He spat in the dust, mounted, and rode off cursing, and did not look back. Ezra turned to Willa at once, all the flat calm gone from his voice. "Are you hurt?" "Only my wrist. He surprised me, that's all." Her hands were shaking now that the danger had passed, at the fear arriving late the way it always did, and she found she couldn't quite make them stop. Ezra reached for her slow, giving her every chance to step back if she needed to. And when she didn't, he drew her carefully against him, one hand at her back, the other still watching the road. Dobbs had disappeared down, as though he didn't fully trust the man to stay gone. "I should have ridden out sooner," he said low, more to himself than to her. "I knew you were later than usual and told myself it was nothing. Won't make that mistake again." "You came in the end, when it counted most," she said, her voice muffled against his shirt. "That's what matters to me. It matters greatly to me that he ever got the chance to lay a hand on you at all, even the once." His jaw was tight, his arms tightening fractionally around her, as if he could somehow undo the last quarter hour by will alone. "I mean to see he doesn't get another one." He walked her back to the ranch rather than let her go on to town, shaken, and sat her at the kitchen table while he fetched cool water for the darkening bruise on her wrist. His hands gentler than she'd have guessed such rough hands could be. "I've never been so frightened," she admitted quiet, "and never so certain someone was coming." "How'd you know I would?" he asked, wringing the cloth out over the basin. "I didn't know it in my head. I knew it the way you know weather's coming before the clouds prove it. Some things a body just trusts once it's been given enough reason to." "I'll always come," Ezra said. And it wasn't a boast, it was a fact stated the same plain way he stated everything, and it landed on her harder than any tender word could have. She looked at him, then really looked at the man who'd stood unmoving in front of a bigger man, without raising a hand, who'd left coffee on a fence post every morning, without being asked, who'd given her his coat in the rain, and asked nothing in return. She reached up and rested her palm flat against his chest over the steady beat of his heart, needing the plain fact of him after the fear Dobbs had left behind. He covered her hand with his own, holding it there. Ezra, Willa. Neither of them said anything more for a long moment. Then he reached up slow enough that she could have stopped him and brushed a strand of hair back from her face, his rough thumb grazing her cheek. I've been wanting to do that since the day you gentled that fool gelding at the depot and didn't even wait for a thank you, he admitted low. Took me long enough to say so. I noticed you watching, she said. I just didn't let myself hope what it meant. Now you don't have to wonder. He said it with a small, crooked smile that undid her more thoroughly than any grand declaration could have managed. She didn't pull away. When he leaned down and kissed her, it was careful, unhurried asking rather than taking, and she answered it with both hands coming up to rest against his chest, feeling his heart going as unsteady as her own. When they parted, he rested his forehead against hers a moment, breathing like a man who'd been holding something in for a long time and had finally set it down. I should have done that weeks ago, he said. I'd have let you weeks ago if you'd only asked, she admitted, and he laughed, a real laugh, low and surprised out of him, the kind she hadn't heard since she'd known him, and the sound of it settled something in her chest that had been unsettled since the day the train left her alone on an empty platform. I mean it plainly, he said, sobering. I don't know how to court a woman properly. Never had to learn twice. But I know I don't want you walking that road afraid again, and I know I don't want to spend another evening pretending I don't watch for you coming up the lane before I've any honest reason to. You've never needed an honest reason. Not with me. She traced her thumb along the back of his hand over the same calluses that had left coffee on a fence post every morning without asking for thanks. I spent a long time believing kindness always came with a bill attached somewhere waiting to be collected. You never once handed me one. Wasn't kindness exactly. Or it was, but it wasn't only that. He looked at her steady, the same directness he'd used the very first day at Foster House. I wanted you here. Simple as that, even when I didn't have the sense to say it. Well, she said, a smile pulling at her mouth despite the ache still throbbing faintly in her wrist. You've said it now, so I have. He pressed a gentle kiss to the bruised skin of her wrist. An apology and a promise both, and Willa felt something in her chest loosen that had been tight since Kentucky, since the courthouse, since every hard mile of the road that had brought her here. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she let herself believe fully that the ground beneath her wasn't going to shift again without warning. They sat together at his kitchen table a good while longer, not saying much of anything, simply letting the evening settle around them, the way it did most nights, now easy and unhurried, until the hour grew late enough that he insisted on walking her back to town himself rather than let her go alone, lantern in hand, her fingers finding his, without either of them quite deciding to reach for the other. Word came a few days later that Bragg had put his outfit up for sale, unwilling to stay in a county where his foreman's conduct had become common talk after Sorensen and two other ranchers witnessed enough of the road encounter to spread it honestly. Dobbs left with him. Neither Willa nor Ezra spoke of it much beyond that. There was by then a great deal else worth talking about. She took to staying for supper most evenings after that, walking back to town only when the last light was nearly gone, and twice more he walked the road with her, rather than let her go alone, lantern in one hand, her fingers laced through his other. Mrs. Foster, no fool, began setting Willa's plate at a slightly later hour without being asked, and said nothing at all about it, which Willa understood for the quiet blessing it was. A week later, they sat on the porch as the light went long and gold over the ridge. Ezra had been quiet the whole evening, and Willa let him keep his silence, sensing something in it. This house has been too quiet 3 years running, he said finally. I don't prefer it that way anymore. When I came here, she said, I had nowhere left to go. Now I don't know that I'm looking for an end to this at all. He went inside and came back carrying a second chair, Alma's worn smooth at the arms. I'm not asking you to replace anything. I'm asking if you'd sit in a chair of your own out here for as long as you'd care to. Is that a question, Ezra Calloway, or a proposal dressed up plain? A slow, unguarded smile broke across his face, the first one Willa had seen reach all the way to his eyes. Both, if you'll have it that way. I'm not a man of fine words, never have been, but I know my own mind, and my mind's been settled on you a while now. Since before the ledgers, if I'm honest though, I hadn't the sense to say so, till a fool named Dobbs near about forced my hand. Then yes, she said, I'll have it that way. For a long moment, neither of them said anything, more content simply to sit together in the deepening blue of early evening, the ranch settling into its familiar night sounds around them. Solomon shifting in his stall, the far-off call of some bird finding its roost, the ordinary quiet of a place that finally fully belonged to both of them. The weeks that followed passed in a kind of quiet industry. Neither of them had words for only actions. Ezra rode into town and spoke with Reverend Voss at Trinity Chapel. Mrs. Foster, once she'd stopped crying long enough to speak plainly, insisted on helping Willa sew a dress from a bolt of pale blue cloth Mrs. Turner set aside special from her own stock, refusing payment for it twice before Willa managed to insist. Solomon, in his own way, seemed to sense a change coming, nosing at Willa's pockets each morning for the sugar she'd taken to carrying, as if he too had decided the ranch was worth settling into for good. The morning of the wedding, Mrs. Foster fussed over the pale blue dress with more nervous energy than Willa herself could summon, insisting on a dozen small adjustments to a hem that had already been perfect the first time she'd checked it. "Hold still, child," she said, pins between her teeth. "A woman only gets to be fussed over like this the once if she's fortunate, and I intend to enjoy it even if you won't." "I'm enjoying it plenty," Willa said, and meant it, though her hands wouldn't quite stop trembling, with something that wasn't nerves, so much as disbelief at her own good fortune. They were married 6 weeks later at Trinity Chapel, Mrs. Turner dabbing her eyes despite her usual brisk composure. Mrs. Foster beaming from the second pew, old man Sorensen, turning out, despite his rheumatism, to see it done. The town that had once let whispers do Bragg's work for him turned out near in full, and if some had come merely out of curiosity, most left having seen something that looked by any honest measure like it had been earned. Ezra stood at the front in his one good suit, looking as uncomfortable in it as any man ever had. And when Willa came up the aisle on Whitlow's arm, the old clerk having offered gruffly, since she had no family of her own to give her away, Ezra's carefully composed face broke into an expression so plainly helplessly happy that half the church laughed softly at the sight of it, Mrs. Turner loudest among them. When Reverend Voss pronounced them married, Ezra kissed her plainly in front of the whole gathered town, settling once and for all any question anyone had dared raise about her place beside him. Solomon, tied outside the chapel with the rest of the wedding party's horses, chose that exact moment to whinny loudly enough that the whole congregation heard it through the open doors, and Willa laughed against Ezra's mouth, unable to help herself, and he laughed too, and neither of them minded one bit that their first kiss as husband and wife was interrupted by a horse with an opinion about the proceedings. 4 years later, the evening light fell long and gold across that same porch, the same 2 chairs, worn smoother now with use, while a boy of 3 chased a hen around the yard with more enthusiasm than sense. "Josiah Calloway, you leave that hen be," Ezra called, no real force behind it, and the boy abandoned the chase at once, grinning, leaning against his father's leg, while Ezra's hand settled easy on his son's dark curls, the same gesture he'd once used to calm a frightened horse. "You're thinking hard on something," Ezra said, settling into the chair beside Willa. "Just thinking how far a person can travel," she said, "and still end up exactly where they were meant to be. I used to lie awake in Lowell thinking the whole of my life had already gone wrong, that whatever was coming next would only be smaller versions of the same disappointment. I'm glad I was wrong about that." "So am I glad," Ezra said, correcting his own words with a small, rueful smile. "Wyoming's a poorer place without you in it, same as I would have been if that gelding had bolted, and you'd never had reason to stay." He took her hand thumb, moving over her knuckles, familiar as breathing. "Good thing you had nowhere left to go that day at the station. Good thing you were the kind of man who came looking," she answered. A girl of one dark curls, already unruly, toddled out from the doorway behind them and made straight for her mother's skirts, and Willa lifted her into her lap, without breaking the rhythm of her needle. Ezra watched the two of them a moment, his daughter's serious eyes so plainly, her mother's fixed on the pebbles she'd carried out with her, and felt the same quiet astonishment he felt most evenings now that a man who'd once thought himself finished with hoping had ended up with a porch full of reasons to hope every single day. "Might build that third chair sooner than I figured," he said. "Might need a fourth before long at this rate," Willa said, and he laughed low and easy, the sound of it carrying out past the corral toward the creek, where his father's marker still stood. Josiah abandoned his hen-chasing at last, and came to lean against his mother's knee instead, and Willa set the mending aside to smooth his dark curls. The same gesture his father used on him, the same gesture Ezra had once used on a frightened horse standing in a barn that no longer held any fear in it at all. Solomon nickered from the corral, ambling over to nose at the fence, as though he too wanted to be included in the evening's small ceremony, and Ezra rose to fetch him a bit of the bread left over from supper, because some habits once formed with care were worth keeping simply for their own sake. The house behind them full now with laughter and small footsteps, and every ordinary sound a family makes, was proof enough that it had never truly been empty, only waiting, same as the both of them had been waiting, without knowing it, for exactly this.
This was never really a story about lost land or a missing feeling, though both matter along the way. It was a story about a man who saw his love in actions long before he found the words, and a woman who learned the hard way not to trust pretty promises until she met one worth trusting. Sometimes the truest kind of romance isn't a grand declaration. It's someone coming when you need them, standing where they said they would, and staying. If you've made it this far, tell me, where are you watching from tonight? Rub your city and stay below. I love seeing how far these stories travel. If this one found its way to you, leave it a like and subscribe for the next one. There's always another story coming, and I would love to have you along for it.